welcome to EoZTV. I'm Elder of Zion, and today our special guest star is Asaf Romirowsky, the Executive Director of Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, as well as an expert on UNRWA, which is what we're going to be speaking about tonight, because it's UNRWA's 70th anniversary that they're celebrating. I'm not sure if there's a reason to celebrate, but that's what they're doing. So welcome, Asaf. Thank you very much for coming. The UNRWA is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I've spoken about it. I've written, I don't know how many, probably hundreds of posts myself about UNRWA. But I did, let's just start at the beginning, because you wrote a fascinating book that I reviewed back in 2016 about the called Religion, Politics, and the Origins of Palestine Refugee Relief. And this was like pre-UNRWA. There was a group of Quakers, actually, the AFSC, that was in charge of relief, of the Palestinian refugees after 48. Can you talk about that a bit?
Under Dean Acheson and others who were involved in what was considered to be Abrahamic, relief, or kind of what was considered to be, I guess, religious theological relief, through Abrahamic faith, and they came with that understanding. And so this is how the Quakers get involved with all of this. One of the interesting parts about the Quakers is that the Quakers actually leave Gaza and they leave the operation because the mandate of American foreign policy in the 50s and 60s was actually resettlement, reintegration, and repatriation. And when they saw UNRWA actually as basically maintaining the problem rather than actually working to resolve the problem, that's one of the reasons why they left the region.
So let's talk about that for a little bit. Clearly, I mean, at the time that before UNRWA at the AFSC, there was I guess it was implied that there would be resettlement of the Arabs in Arab countries, but that was, fairly explicit. Actually, it's from Resolution 194, right? It talked about resettlement. But that was also the basis of UNRWA itself being created. So UNRWA, when it started, did give a shot at this sort of stuff. It actually did attempt to do resettlement, to find jobs for the Arabs that were in the surrounding countries.
Right. I mean, if we're being historically honest about the situation itself, I would say that for the first decade of UNRWA's operation, they tried to maintain that neutrality, which they were created under, trying to create, not taking sides. And what happened, the real shift took place. UNRWA was always claiming that they had no money. And part of the way it worked out was that the Arab world agreed to say, we will give you money, large sums of money, so long as you become, and they have become, a branch, a Palestinian advocate branch, arm to maintain the refugee problem. And so that politicization that they agreed early on not to be part of, they violated that. And UNRWA actually was also created as an Article 22. Article 22 agencies of the United Nations are actually based on voluntary contributions. This voluntary contributions that came out of the Arab world dictated the politics of UNRWA.
So early on you're saying, because actually I didn't know this, early on you're saying it really was the Arab world that was bankrolling UNRWA, because that obviously doesn't happen much nowadays.
Correct. And the fact of the matter is that really I consider this to be the quintessential core problem as it relates to the Arab-Israeli conflict at large. Palestinian identity is rooted in Palestinian refuginess. And so to tell an Arab Palestinian you're no longer a refugee is to say you're no longer a Palestinian. That understanding, that ideology that was so ingrained and goes back to the Egyptians, the Jordanians, about how they were able to mastermind and to really create this imagery, plays into it. By UNRWA, taking the money of the Arab world, what the Arab world had in mind was that they have no responsibility for 1948. And the one thing that maintains the blame game on the fact that 1948 was indeed something created by the Jews, by the West, by the Americans, by the Russians, and it's their problem. They created the problem, ergo it's their problem to solve, is basically rooted in this understanding. And so UNRWA got all this money, took all this money, and in the Arab Muslim world, and especially at that time, and I would say till this day, 1948 is considered to be the original sin. The symptom and the evergreen symptom of that original sin are the Palestinian refugees. This is the holy grail.
And and that's certainly true. How much of it was? I mean, again, I remember looking at early UNRWA reports in which they said, well, the Palestinians don't, have no desire to live anywhere else. They don't want to live in their host countries. They want to return. But, there was no poll, there was no survey or anything like that. It was obviously lots of them were trying to sneak back into Israel, but many other ones were, they wanted to move on with their lives. Lots of them ended up moving to the Gulf. Lots of them didn't want to be in refugee camps. So it was so I don't know how much of it was Palestinians themselves, or how much of it was the Arab countries themselves saying, we're doing this for your good in order to keep you in this status.
Well, it was a political calculus. I mean, you can find quotes going back from Nasser all the way to bin Laden, to Saddam Hussein, to Gaddafi, and others saying we're never going to rest until we resolve the refugee problem. Nobody's ever made any actual physical attempt to make that happen. It's a lot of it has to do with the propaganda. It was a political calculus. One of the parts that I talk about in the book, and with my co-author Alex Jaffe, in an article that Jaffe and I wrote together in Middle East affairs, in Middle East studies, that had to do with Sir Alexander Galloway, who was one of the first heads of the UNRWA office in Amman, Jordan, who wrote a very famous quote that is probably one of the more famous quotes in the Zionist narrative as it relates to the Arab refugees. And I'm paraphrasing here. He basically argued that the Arab world doesn't give a damn about the refugees. They want to keep it as an open wound. That quote eventually got into congressional testimonies in 52, 53, 54, and nobody ever paid much attention to it. The loss, and how the quote was evolved over the years is a story unto its own. But again, this really speaks volumes to the idea that the refugees were used and have been used as pawns for over 70 years as a way to maintain and sustain this conflict. And the gatekeeper of that one evergreen problem, of course, is UNRWA. And so that is the symbiotic relationship that exists between the refugee problem and UNRWA as the gatekeeper of that same problem that they don't want to resolve because no bureaucracy has any incentive to solve it.
So so would you say, so again, and again, you're saying something slightly different than my understanding, but so I was noticing, again, I used to read the UNRWA annual reports, and by the late 50s, it looks like UNRWA pretty much already gave up on the idea of resettlement. They gave up on the idea of the work stuff, and it already was well on its way to becoming essentially welfare.
Right.
I remember something very specific I read about around 1958 or 59, in which UNRWA teachers were teaching the kids, like calisthenics, using the word return or spelling out the word return, fidai or whatever it is.
Right.
So it was, my impression was, it's just that, almost like a Stockholm syndrome, that UNRWA pretty much gave up, saying, well, here's what we have to do in order to move forward. You seem to be saying a lot of it was prompted from the Arab governments.
A lot of it was, but again, the W in UNRWA within the acronym of works has been practically and kindly translated into education, which has become UNRWA's main functionality today, which is where you see the pedagogy within the UNRWA schools and the kind of incitement that plays in and is played out with that. So they've been able to make that happen as a result of their interpretation. Early on, again, the 50s, there was attempts to create skill sets with the idea of moving on beyond their status to create jobs. And with the idea, again, many American foreign policymakers that got involved. And going back to the Quaker story, part of American foreign policy in the 50s and 60s was based on what we did in the Tennessee Valley. And so with the idea of dealing with water irrigation and with the idea of giving people skill sets, creating a middle class, that has never happened within the Palestinian refugee environment. And again, the pressure that came out of the Arab world, and then later on, which, again, this is part of the politicization and the hijacking of the narrative, by the time the 1960s roll in, and then you see the rise of the PLO under Yasser Arafat and many of the founders of the PLO, any attempt for compromise that would have been taking place between the Arab refugees and the State of Israel post-1967 was flatly denied. It was actually Israel's prime minister at the time, Levi Eshkol, who argued to the Arab Palestinians and to UNRWA, go beyond the refugee camps, live your lives. If you don't want us to build the homes for you, we'll allocate the land. Go do that. Now, again, mind you, the historical significance of that, in end of 1967, beginning of 1968, is exactly, in 68 is when Arafat is able to unite Fatah and PLO together. If he gave up the struggle, what he considered to be the struggle for Palestine, and within that identity, of course, is the refugee issue, why would they support the struggle? So, of course, all of these attempts that, of course, were given by the Israelis were, of course, flatly denied.
Sure. And that happened not only in the late 60s, but in the late 70s, I think even into the 80s, that Israel offered to, let's dismantle the camps, let's build you guys permanent places in Gaza or whatever. And I believe there's even a couple of UN resolutions against that.
The fascinating part was, even going backwards a little bit. I mean, the person in charge of refugee issues under the Yishuv at the time, was not Ben Gurion, was actually Sharet. And Sharet was also the liaison to dealing with the Quakers back in Gaza in the 50s. The Quakers came out with a compromise. They argued, again, if you look at the numbers, how many refugees actually existed by the end of 1948, 49, I would take the number about 625. Let's say, there's a debate on the scholarship between, Benny Morris and Ephraim Karsh, about 10 to 15%. But the number, I think, a 600,000, number, 615 is a number that I support based on the calculations and the research that I've done. The compromise that the Quakers proposed was that Israel would take in half that number. The only caveat to make that happen was that the Palestinians, the Arab Palestinians, would accept Israel's right to exist in peace. And of course, again, that was flatly rejected.
Yeah, certainly. What year, I imagine it happened sort of gradually, but essentially what year did the current working definition that UNRWA has of what a refugee is, including all male descendants forever, when did that really start?
So there has been a slow but gradual expansion that goes on from the 60s going until the mid-70s, within those years of the expansion of definition to a point. Originally, it's hereditary, so of course it was only the father to begin with, then it included the mother, another. And so again, the numbers continue to grow and have grown as far as, as we see it today, as far as that slow but steady expansionism of who is an Arab Palestinian refugee. The hereditary aspect, again, is something that is solely unique to the Arab Palestinians. No refugee population. And this is why one of the main differences and the advantage that UNRWA had, because UNRWA was created before the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. They were able to define themselves by themselves, and it was created as a special agency, as a temporary agency, until this problem is resolved. As a result of these special conditions, they've been able to revamp and tweak this definition to where we have it today, where today, according to UNRWA's official account, you're talking between 5 to 6 million, though I have seen other kind of liberal accounts in the UK that amount to 11 million. But the critical issue here is the growth. This is an unnatural growth. It is a superficial growth that has allowed this agency to grow and metastasize. And the direct correlation, of course, is the West. And up until the Trump administration came to office, really, we were funding a lot of this activism. My last calculation was that the United States, over the course of the past 70 years, has, over the years, spent, invested, or whatever you want to look at it, between close to about 66 to 67.5 billion dollars.
Wow.
That have gone into this enterprise that sees no end.
Yeah, and it has no. It doesn't look like it's going to see any end. Did you support the Trump administration completely cutting off funds from UNRWA, or did you think it should happen more gradually? What did you think about that?
I've written, together with my colleague Alex Jaffe, we've actually written several recommendations. We actually published a monograph at the Begin and Sadat Center about the kind of recommendations that should take place. I think that it's not realistic to believe that this, cutting off the funds is going to solve the problem. There has to be a gradual transition. I have argued for years that what UNRWA is doing today is basically acting as a shadow government for the Palestinian Authority. They're double dipping, and if there is actually to be a Palestinian state, then there is also a duplicity of efforts that are going back and they're allowing this to happen. All of these individuals, and UNRWA, by the way, of course, as you know so well, as the largest employer of Palestinians and close to about 30,000 individuals, all of those 30,000 individuals should be employees or civil servants of the Palestinian Authority if there was to be a sustainable Palestinian state. Of course, that's not, the way UNRWA functions, they don't allow for that to happen. So I believe that if you're looking at a long-term systemic change that needs to happen, part of it is breaking the monopoly that UNRWA has over all services, including medical, social services, educational services, and as a way to get transparency and accountability, and really a sense of a transition period that we could actually create. If the Palestinians really want a Palestinian state, they also have to acknowledge the fact that Palestinian statehood is basically, prevented by UNRWA. And so, and the fact that they also have to agree that they have to end the right of return. This is the number one issue, that, you have to transition between staying a refugee in perpetuity, which is how they play the game, to becoming a citizen. And a citizen of a state to be has to have responsibility, accountability, and whatnot. At this point, the cognitive dissonance that exists is when you say the word refugee for any country in the West, the perception is that people are fleeing for their lives, no running water, let alone Wi-Fi. That, of course, is not the reality that you have within the Palestinian quote-unquote refugee camps.
It goes way beyond that, because, for example, Jordan, maybe 90% of the what you were to call Palestinian refugees in Jordan are Jordanian citizens. They're not refugees by any definition whatsoever. And not only that, there's a separate. They have again a completely separate medical system, completely separate educational system, and I did an interesting post in which like the number one mission of all NGOs is to do no harm, and by setting up a parallel system of education and medical for a different population, that's something that hurts the host society. It hurts Jordan. It's completely inefficient, and but also the places where the Palestinians get better education. The people that are supposed to be they're supposed to be integrating with or hate them for this stuff.
Correct. I mean, and actually, and Jordan is the best example as far as what assimilation, what repatriation, what resettlement should look like. I mean, the fact of the matter is that in the 50s and the 60s, there was a Palestinian prime minister in Jordan, and talk about how they moved up in life, and where they are. But again, if you look at the politicization of UNRWA today and the spokesman for UNRWA, one of the key spokesmen for UNRWA today is no other than the Queen herself, Queen Rania, who is of Palestinian descent. When she has hosted and continues to be an advocate for UNRWA itself and fundraisers around the world, she will say resolution for the Palestinian issue is on the other side of the River Jordan, not within Jordanian territory. This is the biggest conundrum for the king and for Jordan at large. They're also afraid that once they open up the gates, then of course they have no incentive and they have no desire whatsoever to include within that Gaza. I mean, again, this is a deeper question about the fragmentation within Palestinian society between West Bankers and Gazans, as it relates to Jordanians and Egyptians, respectfully.
Sure, and in fact, a number of Gazans after '67 went to Jordan, and they're still not citizens.
Correct.
So they have their own separate camp. But even more so, under the areas under Palestinian rule itself, there are still refugee camps. So again, a definition of a refugee is you're leaving your land. These are people that are living on their land. So the implication is, hey, you guys aren't even real Palestinians. You guys have to go back, in return. So it's crazy.
And talk about the biggest scandal of all. The person who owns the most amount of real estate and the most corrupt individual within the Palestinian areas is no other than Yasser Abbas, Mahmoud Abbas's son. Now, when interestingly enough, if you go back to the opening of the new neighborhood outside of Ramallah, Rabi, which was designed to be the neighborhood of all neighborhoods and new and whatnot, at the ribbon cutting, there was a question by a journalist that was asked, so are the refugees moving in here? And the answer was, what are you talking about? We want people from the Gulf to come and invest and buy condos here and whatnot. So, tell you about, the kind of disconnect that exists between, what goes on the ground and what is, what the perceptions are. So,
yeah, absolutely. And of course, the place that the Palestinians are being treated the worst is Lebanon.
Yes.
The camps there are in terrible shape. And this isn't UNRWA's fault. This is, it's Lebanon's fault. But it's like, and again, this is just a topic nobody really talks about. Is like, and they'll just blame Israel instead of. Occasionally, you'll see Arab voices that are saying, hey, things are really bad in Lebanon. They ought to do something. But again, Israel's the scapegoat.
Well, it's an interesting point that you raised there, because what was interesting is that after, during the Arab Spring / Islamist winter, where you did see individuals, again, the Assad regime killing its citizens and refugees and whatnot, there was a lot of movement of Syrian refugees who were fleeing to the UNRWA offices in Lebanon. And UNRWA said, in Lebanon, we can't take care of you because we're only taking care of Palestinians. They give you the double standard. And so it became very clear, especially in a kind of an eye-opener as far as what was happening during those years about the gold standard of refugee status, that is the Palestinians, and the rest, which was quite, kind of a more introspective look at what is actually happening within the Arab world and within this imagery of who is actually a refugee, which again speaks volumes. And again, it actually hurt at that point in time UNRWA's fundraising, though they will start, to claim that, of course, they're taking care of everybody. All we need is more money and write me a large check. If I only had that, if I only had those resources. And by the way, many of those camps in Lebanon, and in other places, were also feeders, at the time, and still for terrorist activity. The PLO, Al Qaeda, ISIS. I mean, there has been a ton of activity that's been going on there as far as munitions and arms and politicization. This is all part of the architecture that has been created by design, and much of these areas, the so-called refugee camps, have been created as feeders in order to make this happen.
Sure. Just now looking towards the future, I mean, the business model of UNRWA, so to speak, is just not sustainable with a complete, with a growing population. People are, okay, Europe has been stepping up, but the Arab world is pretty much losing interest. The U.S. obviously has already dropped all of its funding, and the number of refugees, or pseudo refugees, keeps growing. So, do you see? I mean, it's something's got to break somewhere. I don't know if it's going to be, that they'll say, hey, okay, the people in Jordan are no longer, we can't call them refugees anymore. I'm not sure what's going to be, but what do you see is happening?
Well, I agree. Something has to give, and this is not sustainable. I mean, no bureaucracy can maintain this quote unquote natural growth, and based on this growth of numbers, UNRWA continues to ask for more money. What has happened, since the Trump administration dropped its funding, to zero when it came to funding of UNRWA, Europe, has made up the difference, and so what has happened was they re-upped 2 allocations worth, and obviously, so clearly now they're hurting financially because they made up the difference for 2 years. There have been monies that have come in from Asia. The Arab world, will indeed potentially step it up. To that end, this is where you might see shifts and cracks that are happening if countries in the Gulf, and in particular areas in Saudi Arabia and other places, start saying, we need to kind of change this narrative and look at that instead of writing blank checks to the PA. Then there will be a crack. Otherwise, they're going to use that imagery in order to try to sell themselves as relevant, and they continue to do so. Sure. And I think that this is, one of the biggest challenges. But even today, I mean, look, UNRWA is watching, and so are the Palestinians. They're hoping, of course, that Donald Trump does not get reelected. And if that happens, that of course they see it as an opportunity that they could cajole, cultivate the next president. If it be Joe Biden, then they will figure that we have had success with Democratic leaders. Maybe we can have a chance to once again re-up the money. There is no end date to this. I mean, this is part of if you go in UNRWA's documents, UNRWA will say, we will end our services when there is resolution for the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We know, while at the same time, this is the catch-22, they are the gatekeeper of the one problem that continues to, to stop that from actually happening.
Absolutely.
And so this is, the push and pull that you see here within this conversation.
Do you see any chance of something, and I'm just, this may be completely wishful thinking on my part, but the Palestinians are better educated than most other Arabs, and to this degree, you do have to say that UNRWA is responsible for some of that. They are, they're harder workers than most Arabs. That's the reason they go to Gulf countries and they become, relatively successful there, although without citizenship. Do you see, because there's clearly, within the Gulf, the Arab countries seem to be getting really sick of the entire problem, and they're trying to move more towards Israel and more towards a Trump-like peace plan, whatever it's going to be. Do you see something dramatic happening, like Saudi Arabia or other Gulf countries just saying, you know what, we're going to start giving citizenship to Palestinians, to a couple 100,000 or something like that, which would just highlight the problem, and
right.
And maybe that could be a way of breaking the deadlock.
Potentially. I mean, I don't see it happening in mass. I mean, I think you're really talking about an orthodoxy. As I said earlier, in the show, this is the ingredient of Palestinian identity. I think that part of the biggest challenge as it relates to all of this has to do with the fact that there has to be a Palestinian identity that is removed from refuginess and is removed from anti-Semitism, which has been part of the key ingredients that have designed and have created Palestinian identity. And so, it's not about the fact that, they can still have their collective memory, but there has to be a transitional part that if if their end goal really is to create an Arab Palestinian state, then this is what statehood actually means. They have said it, but they have not acted on it. And so I think that you are seeing cracks. I think if 100 years ago we were talking about the creation of Arab states, we're now in a phase where we're talking about the collapse of the Arab state architecture. And I think that is revealing in many of the cleavages within the Arab world, and in particular within the Arab-Palestinian narrative. And I think that there is a sense of fatigue, that needs to happen. I mean, you're going to see a bigger transition. I mean, Mahmoud Abbas is now serving in his almost 15 years of a 4-year term. What happens post Mahmoud Abbas? And where is this younger generation coming? In the sense of are they willing to put the ideology aside in order to move along their own lives? And you are correct. I mean, in the 70s, Palestinians were the fastest growing economy, and they're very educated society. As a result, by the way, of the educational system that was created by the Israelis for the Palestinians.
I didn't know that. I would like to get into it, but I think it's about time to actually wrap things up. But again, thank you very much for being my guest. I appreciate it. I'm not sure what my next show is going to be, but hopefully pretty soon. And but at any rate, this was great. And for now, again, today also is Giving Tuesday. If anybody wants to donate either to Elder or to SPME, that would be good too. But for now, I am Elder of Zion, and we're signing off. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure.